Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops number 38 of Series 7. The question for today is, what attitudes should we adopt towards negative values and emotions? The reading from one of my works, The Pursuit of Value, Chapter 2, Section 2. So we have recently been discussing certain issues in relation to value as a principle of life. These were criteria of value, the will to power, the will to truth, life, death, other people, and injustice. Last week we focused on negative experiences like guilt, resentment, intolerance, and hurt. Today I want to discuss and re-evaluate negative values and attitudes. Among these are classic negative values like alienation, enemy, anxiety, and guilt. Other more visceral negative values are hate, disgust, fear, resentment, and of course ressentiment. I want to apply the concept of value to negative attitudes in two ways. One is that our perspectives of them aren't objectively fixed, but are established by guiding values. Another is how an affirmation of value, or the will to value, can mitigate negative attitudes. I will first give three brief examples of different perspectives that change our attitudes to negative events. One is Nietzsche's too frequently quoted statement, "What doesn't kill us makes us stronger." Another is advice from a Monty Python sketch to look on the bright side of life. And lastly is the paradoxical idea in Christianity of salvation in death and crucifixion. We will look at these ideas in greater depth shortly. Yet I want to note a choice between these two different responses to negative events or experiences. One is to try to integrate or digest these things into our psyches. Another is to treat them as nothing or as aspects of absences in our experience. Is it a question of the wisdom of engagement or the wisdom of walking away? Recent workshops have presented death as an absence of the future and injustice as a mistaken presence of value. Today I want to consider absence of value as a response to various other negative experiences. But even these distinctions may not explain the complexity of human reactions to perceived negative events. This is because reactions can be to associations or meanings of various kinds of varying significance. They can be reactions to arbitrary events in the past, in our childhood, and in our unconscious. Or they can be expressing some mood, attitude, or set of values or value states. A discussion like this can only hope to deal with particular states such as above. Yet I hope that our discussion can throw some light onto these complexities. The attitude of disgust has received some attention in respect to its different interpretations. Disgust, for example, is usually regarded as just a natural, visceral reaction to objectively undesirable objects. This is because it is a reaction to the prospect of contamination by disease, excrement, or corpses. In this sense, disgust is connected to anxiety about our animalistic and decaying nature. But Martha Nussbaum notes that people are disgusted by very different things and by different beliefs. Disgust thereby has cognitive content that responds to beliefs and expectations. Nussbaum, for example, holds that disgust is often used to reinforce prejudices, to cordon people off. She gives examples like the caste of the untouchables and the practices of homosexuals. My interest here is also in the cognitive content of negative values such as disgust, and that our attitudes towards negative states or values and our judgments may be too quick, and that premature judgment seems to be the case in moral as well as aesthetic judgments. I want to give a few examples where reversals of attitude have been overlooked. To start with, Christianity provides an example of a paradoxical attitude to pain, suffering and human finitude. Theologians, for example, are divided over the question of why Christ had to die, and there are alternative explanations. But John Haldane, papal advisor, regards Christianity as providing a narrative of human finitude and brokenness. Slavoj Žižek contrasts Eastern religions with the dark core of Christianity that confronts death directly. In my view, Christianity, as God made man, provides believers with a sanctification of human finitude. This is because God is the believer's highest conceivable value, and the death of Christ as God thereby sanctifies death by being embraced into the highest good. My point here is that a metaphysical principle is being expressed mythologically, and that believers are able to resolve negative events with God's blessing. Paradoxically, Nietzsche is in some agreement with this Christian reversal of attitude. Nietzsche holds that suffering isn't a problem and even can be a stimulus to greatness. This is often expressed in his above quoted saying, "What doesn't kill us makes us stronger." This is part of Nietzsche's affirmation of everything, including suffering and loss. For example, he proclaims this affirmation of life in his Amor Fati, yea sayings, and saying yes to life. And he explains this attitude with his view that he who has a why can endure any how. He is certainly advocating purpose and value as a means of resolving suffering and loss. But Nietzsche's idea of affirming everything is sometimes criticized as value monism. That is, it values everything equally without differentiation or discrimination. Yet Nietzsche's trenchant criticisms of Christian and conventional values is hardly indiscriminate. My question is, how can he affirm everything yet be so critical of some values? My answer is in a certain kind of discrimination that I'm working towards. Yet another example of ambiguity that raises the same question is provided by Heidegger's view of anxiety. Heidegger regarded anxiety as an indication of authenticity in confrontation with death. He writes, "Anxiety in the face of death is anxiety in the face of potentiality for being." Freud, however, associates anxiety with alienation and guilt, seemingly without any mitigating factors. And he describes guilt as, I quote, "the most important problem in the development of civilization." And I ask whether this is a difference between philosophical and psychological approaches. Yet from a religious point of view, guilt is often seen as a much needed recognition of sin. But for Edmund Burke, guilt distorts all the faculties of the human mind, it perverts them, unquote. For Freud, guilt arises from fear of authority, of society, religion, the superego, and conscience. And he writes, guilt is at bottom nothing else but a topographical variety of anxiety. On this view, guilt is both a kind of anxiety and a form of internal dissonance. Similarly, Ruth Benedict distinguishes guilt from shame as personal and social conditions, respectively. Shame is a violation of social values, while guilt feelings arise from violations of one's internal values. Yet Freud defines guilt more precisely as a fear of loss of love, of self-love, and of the love of others. Freud connects the anxiety of guilt with a loss of love that is also a loss of self-assurance and self-value. An implied resolution of guilt is thereby found in a removal of the fear of loss of love, and I suggest that this can be found in appropriate forms of self-value or self-love. The idea and experience of guilt has been a long-standing and pernicious problem in the Judeo-Christian world. The Old Testament describes ritual sacrifice, and a scapegoat is sent into the wilderness. A goat was sacrificed whilst a living scapegoat was released into the wilderness. Christianity offers a more substantial and pertinent appeasement of resolution of guilt. Christ is both man and God, offering both a human sacrifice and a God able to forgive sins. Nietzsche unexpectedly describes this as, I quote, a stroke of genius on the part of Christianity. Nietzsche goes on to write, God himself makes payment to himself, God as the only being who can redeem man from what has become unredeemable for man himself. The creditor sacrifices himself for his debtor, unquote. Yet Christopher Hitchens ridicules the idea that we are created to be sick and commanded to be well. That is, mankind has falsely conceived of himself as both guilty and unable to help himself, and that mankind has thereby sought a divine saviour outside of himself to redeem himself. Although Nietzsche and Hitchens have different views of Christianity, both can be correct. Nietzsche's understanding is mythological, whereas Hitchens is rationalist and factual. Religion and existentialism are unwilling bedfellows. Alienation and guilt are prominent in both. A philosophical version of guilt can be found, for example, in Sartre's notion of bad faith. Sartre presents bad faith as an attempt to escape freedom and responsibility. But bad faith is also a form of self-deception that incurs inauthenticity and alienation. Sartre illustrates what he means by bad faith in his notion of a spirit of seriousness. In essence, the spirit of seriousness is inauthentically taking subjective values as objective. Sartre gives many examples, like the judge who says he had to condemn the man to death. Yet the self-deception required by bad faith alienates the person from himself. Yet alienation is another ambivalent concept that must be both embraced and rejected. Alienation can be from society or from oneself, and again involves attitudes and values, not just facts. More specifically, reflective consciousness incurs forms of alienation that are both beneficial and harmful. An alienation from both self and the world is metaphorically expressed in the story of the fall in Genesis. That is, the Genesis story is a telling metaphor for the development of human consciousness and its capacities. Their eyes are opened, they knew shame, good and evil, death and alienation from nature, animals and God. It illustrates alienation from other conscious beings and from oneself. In this sense, alienation is an inseparable aspect of our conscious existence. Less positively, alienation is represented negatively in religion in its central idea of God and God's relation to man. The idea is that God represents our alienated selves, as such held by Feuerbach, Freud and Jung. For Feuerbach, Freud is a psychological projection of ourselves that we do not yet know explicitly. With Freud, the superego is the father figure of God which dominates our wishes. Jung writes, we cannot tell whether God and the unconscious are two different entities. Note that God represents both beliefs about ourselves and our highest values from which the believer is alienated. Feuerbach captures this ambiguity with the words that knowledge of God is self-knowledge, and theologians agree that God is also the believer's highest conceivable value. The paradox here is that the believer both understands and misunderstands himself in the idea of God, and the believer both values and alienates himself through his belief and in a veneration of God. In discussing the topic of alienation, we can see that Marx and Nietzsche make an interesting contrast. Karl Marx has little psychology. He emphasizes sociology, economics and anthropology. Nietzsche emphasizes psychology with little sociology, economics or anthropology. Freud is known for his psychology, but he also has a lot to say about sociology. Marx is known for his theory of work and the worker's alienation from the product of one's work. He views alienation from one's work as a surplus product, as the basis of social class and division. Marx thereby offers us accounts of social alienation and alienation from oneself in one's work. And his solutions come from social revolution rather than any personal development. Another negative attitude related to alienation that we should consider is that of anomie. Students of sociology will remember making contrasts and comparisons between alienation and anomie. Anomie implies social disengagement rather than the estrangement of alienation. Yet again, I want to raise the possibility of ambiguous attitudes towards anomie. The idea of anomie originated in ancient Greece, revived by Durkheim and Robert Merton in the 20th century. The word anomie means the absence of laws, rules, norms, values, or lack of social integration. For Merton, most people strive after social goals, resulting in anomie when access to those goals is blocked. This results in either deviant behavior, such as in rebellion or innovation, or conformity, in retreat and or ritualism. Yet anomie isn't just a matter of acknowledging different conceptions of things, resulting in physical behavior. In Merton's view, the frustration of goals results in certain states of mind like disengagement, depression, or a lack of motivation. Or alternatively, anomie can produce innovation, such as in rebellion or doing philosophy. My point here is Merton's ambiguous responses to anomie as either frustration or innovation. More specifically, anomie is produced by an absence of laws, rules, norms and values. Yet anomy is embraced and regarded as a virtue by some views, such as in existentialism and postmodernism. And like some phenomenologists, I regard absence as a feature of consciousness with positive functions. So anomy is presented above as an absence of value, where alienation is more of a contrast of values. I now want to consider some of the negative and positive consequences of the absence of value. Yet an absence of value arising from subjectivity is often regarded as a form of nihilism. For example, in The Brothers Karamazov, Dostoevsky wrote, "If God is dead, everything is permitted." Slavoj Žižek replies, "If God exists, everything is permitted," evident in immoral religious teachings. Another example is moralistic judgments which illegitimately enhance the self-value of the agent. Such examples illustrate how the subjectivity or absence of certain values might be preferable to their presence. I want to consider how absence of value has other positive as well as negative consequences. Nietzsche, for example, sought alternatives to moral values in experiences like aesthetics and sensuality. Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil doesn't endorse moral anarchy. It seeks a different way of calibrating human behaviour, as in psychology and social science. And the subjectivity or absence of moral value implies that actions cannot be moral or immoral in themselves. Then murder, rape or theft, for instance, would not be objectively or intrinsically immoral. Yet we would still reject them on account of their heinous nature. We have previously discussed whether objects, thoughts, actions, mental states and people have intrinsic value. My view is that only certain mental states and people are candidates of intrinsic value. Yet some actions might still be regarded as unethical on account of their heinous character. What we're doing here is considering different ways of assessing negative or absent values. Consider the ethical notion of justice and its dependence on rights as an objective value. The notions of justice, rights and objective values have all been strongly criticised. One criticism of justice that we won't discuss now is that it's a euphemism for revenge. Yet the notions of justice and rights may be essential for maintaining social order. David Hume held justice to be a human invention, but not one that society can dispense with. Jeremy Bentham described the idea of natural rights that underpin justice as nonsense on stilts. Alistair MacIntyre further argues that the idea of human rights didn't exist before 1400. My point is that we might be better off without such notions as rights as objective or intrinsic values. That is, one criticism of the notion of rights is that they are objectified wants, wishes or values. And as noted earlier, a similar criticism of the idea of justice is that it is a covert form of revenge. Revenge is often considered an irredeemably negative attitude on a similar level as guilt. Nietzsche's ressentiment is also often thought of as a corrosive lust for revenge. And Nietzsche combines guilt and revenge as essential components of Christian atonement. In such cases of guilt, insult and revenge, in a person's mind, something must be done to put things right. In Christian atonement, God himself dies to rectify the cosmic order. In the particular requirements of revenge, a price must be paid by the offender himself. We should consider the positive consequences of subjectivity on negative states like revenge. If values are subjective, revenge would be difficult to sustain without objective supporting beliefs. That is, the supposedly objective component of revenge, guilt or resentment, would be dissolved. And we can see the positive effect of an absence of value on the negative state of revenge. So we may think it preferable that revenge and its motivating values did not exist. Yet, as earlier, there would be a psychological component of revenge that would still need to be attended to. The issue is again here of what attitude should we adopt to such resistant psychological components. Should it be moral condemnation, acceptance, or psychological therapy? We usually think of the presence of value as good and its absence as bad. This is a theme in religion and in the ontological argument, where existence is preferred to non-existence. Yet even in religion, thinkers such as Augustine regarded evil as a privation or an absence of good. This is another perspective on our theme of ambiguity towards or even the reversal of the bad. So I'm trying to consider here the value of absence, or the absence as a value. For example, the absence of something is sometimes regarded as an essential aspect of something. Buddhists and others speak of an absence of attachment and the significance of the non-self. And Buddhists would favour the wisdom of absence or letting go of negative experiences. As a metaphysical principle, Hegel argues that non-being is necessary to the existence of being. For Sartre, consciousness is itself a lack or desire for being, constituted on nothingness. Sartre consequently describes value as the lack that can simultaneously both be and not be. Yet Sartre seems to overlook the diversity of values that offers primary positive value states as experiences. For example, positive states like moral satisfaction, self-esteem, magnanimity, joy, gratitude and respect. And Sartre's accounts may simply be disingenuous descriptions of absent objectives to be realized in the future. Yet there is something enigmatic about values which require absence in order to be accounted for. And it is with reference to value that an ambiguity of attitude seems to be the most relevant. Chesterton portrays a soldier as having to seek his life in a spirit of furious indifference to it. That is, wisdom or success here lies in an absence of the wrong kind of concern. And this is a principle that could be applied to practically every life activity. A more subtle inversion of value can be found in the attitude of irony. Irony was elevated to a form of philosophy by Socrates, Kierkegaard and even Richard Rorty. And Socrates himself as knowing presents himself as knowing nothing as a way of challenging people's views. In another version, the hero of the story turns out to be the bad guy and the underdog wins out. Yet in the activities of morality, meaning and purpose as a pursuit of value, absence has a more specific meaning. That is, as a pursuit of value, there is a requirement of an absence of value or value refrain. The pursuit of value isn't just a maximization of value, but sets quality over quantity. In conclusion, we started out by asking whether we should integrate negative experiences into our psyches or treat them as nothing. There is a case to be made out here for both approaches, and they could be described as psychological and philosophical, respectively. Yet in this discussion, the preference has been for a philosophical absence. But again, are negative emotions like anger, grief, scorn, fear and cowardice morally culpable? Should we regard them morally, relativistically, therapeutically, or as Nietzschean challenges? Or should we look past them to a more fundamental principles of value? In this way, we discuss the increasingly accepted idea that guilt is a mistaken attitude that we should relinquish. That is, should we come to terms with, rather than morally judge guilt, together with its many causes. But consciousness may observe emotion and moderate its outcome, but can't always remove it. We also saw an ambiguity towards other states like alienation, anomie and anxiety. Yet with respect to moralism, objective values and fixed principles, an absence of value was preferred to its presence. These considerations imply an ambiguity towards negative values and disvalues. But this ambiguity of values also implies moral relativity. But how far does this relativity go? These considerations might imply the relativity of action or the material content of moral values. But could this thinking also lead to an ambiguity or relativity of the principles of value or morality? For example, Sartre presents an ethical inversion by Jean Genet, good be my evil, evil be my good. This possibility may depend upon what we think of as good or evil. In my view, there is a fundamental principle of value that can't be reversed. My proposal for such is an affirmation of value, the value expressed as the will to value. This would be a principle whose reversal would be contradictory and self-defeating. And the principle that is able to take absence into itself is the will to value, leading to a sufficiency of value. And the quality of that value is maintained by a relation to absence, not maximization or quantification. And I have argued for this principle in other workshops and won't be doing again here at this point. So let me have your comments and criticisms at the meeting or on websites like Zoom or meetup.com.